and our thought tonight is from victims to victors. And that's been the theme of this chapter, that indeed the children of Israel, well, they had allowed themselves to think of themselves as victors, victims, because of the circumstances they found themselves in, circumstances they had no control over. And we see how those circumstances were changed very quickly, and they soon became victors over their circumstances. And the challenge for us as modern day Christians is to realise too that, well, life is not meant to be fair, but we have a God who is fair, and he can control the circumstances, and he has a plan and a purpose for his people. He has a plan and a purpose for our lives. We might not always understand it. We might not be able to grasp what is happening in our lives at a particular time, but he does expect a response. And we're not to see ourselves as victims of our circumstances and wallow in self-pity. He expects us to be able to lift ourselves over and above those circumstances, to be able to see the one who controls those circumstances. And as we found out, indeed, the people of Israel became victors over their enemies last week when they were able to confront, and we find that indeed 500 just around the palace area of Susa were destroyed in the battle. And we found that Esther asked for another day, and this is what this particular aspect is dealing with, that next day after the 13th. And so the first thing that I want to challenge us is something that we need to be challenged about: the thankfulness articulated. What is thankfulness? And why should we be thankful? What is thankfulness? We've all experienced it, but what is it? Some would say that thankfulness is an attitude of gratitude. That would be an easy one, an attitude of gratitude. But it's the art of giving thanks. And it's the art of giving thanks, and it's something that everyone can experience from time to time. And they can experience that from any culture in the world, to be thankful. It's a process of being aware of people, of places and things. It's to remember the past, the present, and the future events, to remember our experiences, whether they're physical, emotional, or spiritual. It means seeing the positive perspective of things, the things that are important to us. In other words, the things we appreciate, the things that we value, to enable us to overcome the negatives when we're confronted with such things in our life. When they do come, practice the art of being thankful. You know, it's hard to be thankful when things are not going our way. As one blogger makes this statement, he says, you need to have an awareness of who you are and how you look at the world. This brings clarity. You know who you are, you know what you are, you know what you do, and you don't care what the world thinks or says about you. Now that's a statement, because too often we do care about what the world thinks about us, the people in it, the people we work with, and we do value their opinions. We're not comfortable in our own skin of who we are. When we are, this allows us to prioritise our time, to prioritise our energy, our efforts and our resources, the things, if you like, that matter the most to us. This enables us to make decisions easily, focus on what brings you joy and fulfilment, because you're thankful for what you have in life, and you don't focus on what you could have or what you feel you're entitled to have. You're not adopting a victim mentality approach to life, thinking that, well, this life owes me something. You have that sense of entitlement. That's what our world is telling us today. But if you're thankful, you're grateful for anything and everything that you experience in life. You become a victor over circumstances. You have an attitude of gratitude for what you have and what has been done. You don't live your life around people or events. You don't take those things for granted. Being thankful, you enjoy every person, every event, and you take them on that board. And this is what these verses are bringing out. An attitude of gratitude. It's the art of being thankful. As we look at our text, the achievement in verse 15, the Jewish people in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar. They killed 300 people in Susa, but they did not take their belongings. Now remember from our previous session, Esther requested that Xerxes give the Jewish people one extra day. So this is the 14th day of the month. On the 13th day of the month, they had been confronted by the Persian enemies, and 500 people had been killed. 500 men had been killed, and the king had granted her request. So our text says the people around Susa, around the palace area, gathered together the next day, and they were confronted once again. 300 more men were killed around that area. Now, when you look at it, adding the 13th day and the 14th day, 800 men had been killed because of the determination to exterminate the Jewish population. Once again, our text, it emphasizes that the motivation for the Jewish people was not so they could do this for profit or to get possessions or to gain an advantage by getting property. It was all about protection, nothing more, nothing less. So the enemies couldn't turn around and say, well, you killed those people so that you could benefit, so that you could get something from them, their wealth, their properties, or their possessions. That's what it was about. They didn't take anything. And yet, in the edict, they were allowed to take the spoils of war. We look at the accomplishment in verse 16. At that same time, all the Jewish people in the king's empire also met to protect themselves and to get rid of their enemies. They killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not take their belongings. So here we're giving a bigger picture of how in the 127 provinces of Persia, how under Haman's decree they were given the right to take and kill the Jewish people and take, if they like, their properties and everything that they had. And here it's given us a big picture that with what happened at Susa, another 300 men were killed. So 800 men were there. But the total casualty, or if you like, I like to call it the total body count throughout the 127 provinces was 75,000 people that were killed. And when you think about it, that's a sizable part of a population. And they were all intent on killing Jewish people. 75,000 of them who perished. Now, what it's saying here in our text is not promoting and glorifying war. They're not good ideas, and neither are they pleasant. And when you think about it, 75,000 people died. Why? Because they hated the Jewish people. That was their problem. And it's a reminder for us today as Christians that we face many struggles in this world because we're simply God's people. Many Christians are being murdered or persecuted for their faith from a world that stands, if you like, in opposition to the good news of Jesus Christ. They reject him and everything that he stands for. Now, it was no different to the Jewish people. They had to confront an enemy that wanted them dead. Now, we're told after such a bloodbath and slaughter of so many people, what should the people expect? And what happened is there was a rest. There was peace. There was no more confrontations. There was no more wars for either Jews or Persians. The Jewish people had accomplished their mission. They defended and protected themselves against people who meant them harm to the point of extermination. Now, as I was preparing this and thinking about it, I marvel at the restraint of the Jewish people. And why I marvel is they didn't want this confrontation. They didn't want or start it. They never asked for it. It was their enemies who were determined that on this day, and they had 9 months from the time that it was decreed by Haman, they were all waiting for this day. They didn't want it. It was like a sword of doom hanging over them. And finally it happened. But they never asked for it. But what I noticed here, they were prepared to see things through to the end. They were confronted. They stood firm and assembled together as God's people. And they overcame their enemy. But they didn't gain a thing from their encounter. Even though, legally, they're entitled to take the spoils or possessions and properties of their attackers. That was in the law. They could do it. And yet they chose not to do it. We see the appearance. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th day they rested and made it a day of joyful feasting. But the Jewish people in Susa met on the 13th and 14th days of the month of Adar. They rested on the 15th day and made it a day of joyful feasting. So what we have here around Susa is 2 days of fighting and bloodshed. It ended up in victory for the Jewish people. They stood strong, they were united as they faced a very aggressive opposition for their existence. On the 15th day of the month, the people rested. And as the text indicates, they had a time of celebration, a time of feasting. The reason being very simple, they had been victorious. There was a calmness, there was a peacefulness that started to permeate through the Persian provinces. All that tension, all that doom, all that worry and anxiety was now released. And now there was a sense of gladness, a sense of feasting. The personal struggle between the citizens of Persia and the Jewish population was now removed. The Jewish people will finally free the burdens they've been carrying. It's like having a weight. They threw it off. Their enemies were gone. Peace had a chance to start working and unite the Persian kingdom. Now we have the privilege of looking back at all these events, and in those events we can see the unseen hand of God all over it. God taking this piece, moving it here, moving another piece here, moving another piece here to deliver his people. Esther was chosen to be queen over the Persian kingdom. Mordecai was promoted to the second most powerful person in the kingdom. Esther's position had been granted and delivered in opposition to Haman's decree. And the enemy of the Jews, defeated. Why? God moved the pieces and the places and the events to transpire just as he wanted them to. Now some people will say, hey, look, Pastor, that's all coincidence. All the stars were in alignment. Problem is that all of these events of protection and life had been stated previously by God. And God always keeps his promises to his people without exception. Now it's interesting, as one old-time commentator says, the result of what has come about is ultimately left up to one word for us to consider. That word is faith. God has done all the things he has done in such a way that it takes faith to believe them. The earth looks old, but the Bible says it is young. Where is your faith? The Lord promises destruction by flood, but the skies are sunny. Where is your faith? The Lord says he is our defender, but we're hemmed in by our enemies. Where is your faith? The boat is sinking, but the Lord is right there with you. Where is your faith? The word is written, but the resurrection of a dead man seems impossible. Where is your faith? The Bible doesn't say it's easy to believe, but it does ask us to do so. God looks for faith in his creation. And so a little bit of faith is better than no faith. Will we chalk up the defeat of the enemy to our own goodness and our own skills and abilities? Or will we call out to the Lord in thanks and praise? In the end, the only thing that we can give God is our faith. Loving God requires faith, first of all, that he exists. Praising God requires faith that he's listening. Praying to God through Jesus Christ implies we believe in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. So that's a lot to grab hold of. But where is our faith tonight? Is it in us? Is it in things? Is it in circumstances? Is it in what we control? Or is it in what God has said he will do? Then we see the attention. This is why the Jewish people who live in the country in small villages celebrated on the 14th day of the month of Adar. It is a day of joyful feasting and a day for exchanging gifts. Now, what we have here is that the villages and towns, they were unwalled. And the time is described as one of joy and banqueting. It's a day of celebration. On this day, they would send out manna or portions to one another. What it means there, and I didn't put it together, but meaning sweet cakes. Their mourning turned to joy. The weeping, the wailing turned into banqueting. The sackcloth and ashes were replaced with the sending out of gifts of food to one another. When we gather in worship with people of like faith on a regular basis, why do we meet together? What is the purpose of us even being here tonight? We could be somewhere else, doing something else. So why as Christians do we meet together on a Sunday? Well, the Bible makes it very plain. We gather together to encourage one another to worship our God. We encourage one another by meeting together. But many of our friends, many of our loved ones don't have that joy or that worship. And yet, you and I possess the greatest gift ever given. We have a wonderful opportunity to share this gift with others who have yet, they don't receive it or know about it. And we need to share our gift, our faith, with others. Why? Because we believe our God is sovereign over the lives of men. We believe he can provide a victory for those who belong to him. And although we might face many adversities in this life, we are more than conquerors through Jesus Christ. And so we need to look to him for strength and wisdom when we have needs on a difficult day. And that's paying attention. It's not just mouthing words. The reality is our words and our walk should be in sync. Now, one of the things I've learned about computers or iPhones, I don't have much time with iPhones, if you want them to work, you've got to sync them together. And that means you make sure that they're working. And it doesn't take much to stop them from working. I had a tech that came over to implement something for me that I scratched my head. I didn't know what I was doing. And it took him best part of 45 minutes to work out how he was going to do it. 45 minutes. And you know what? He was ready to give up. And then he stopped and thought, no, I am going to do this. And you know what? He found the solution was right in front of him. I hadn't seen it, he hadn't seen it, but the answer was right in front. He was able to rectify that, and it worked. He got them in sync. And it was just something little that stopped the fellowship, stopped them working together. And sometimes in life, the little things are the things that trip us up. It's a little thing that's right there in front of us, and yet it will trip us up. In verses 20 to 23, I have called the tribute anniversary. Now, each year, the Jewish people celebrate this event, and they call it one word. Do you know what it is? Starts with the letter P. Purim. P-U-R-I-M. And is celebrated, guess what day? The 14th day of Adar, which, and I'm not a prophet, but I looked this up. In 2024 in Israel, it begins on a Saturday night, March the 23rd. And it continues through Sunday, March the 24th, often extending through to Monday in Jerusalem. So you have it next year, in March 23 and 24, it will be Purim. Write that down, see if I'm right, because I got this from a Jewish website. Purim is the time appointed to remember the salvation of the Jewish people in ancient Persia from Haman's plot to kill and destroy and annihilate them. Purim means, well, what does Purim mean anyway? It means lots, L-O-T-S, lots in ancient Persia. The holiday was named since Haman had thrown lots to determine what day he would carry out his plan to destroy the Jews. Now, what happens on that day? Well, there's a reading of the book of Esther, which recounts the story of this miracle. This is done once on the eve of Purim. It's done again the following day, with giving money gifts to at least 2 poor people, sending gifts of 2 kinds of people to at least 1 person. A festive Purim feast, which often includes wine or other intoxicating beverages. And one of the other things that I found are cool Purim facts. Now, I say cool because they're interesting. In modern times, the plans of some of Israel's worst nations have been stopped on this day. Now, you might say, oh, well, what? That's fascinating. In the early 1950s, Joseph Stalin, the ruthless butcher of millions of innocent people, had plans for dealing with the Jewish problem. In the USSR, just as things were reaching a crisis point in 1953, he died. Can you name the day he died? Guess what it was? On the very day of Purim, he died. In 1990, Saddam Hussein of Iraq defiantly invaded Kuwait. As pressure ramped up from the international community, his army began firing Scud missiles into Israel. The rabbi repeatedly assured the people of Israel they would be protected. After the US forces led attack against those of Iraq, they were quickly victorious. The hostilities end. Can you guess what day it ended on? Purim. Interesting facts. When God's people, Israel, have been attacked, it's interesting that on those days, their enemies were defeated, just as Haman was. Coincidental? I think not. And there's more that you can have a look at. Now we see the act in verse 20. Mordecai wrote down everything that happened. Then he sent letters to all the Jewish people in all the empire of King Xerxes far and wide. So we have God's person, Mordecai, the right person at the right time, being the Prime Minister. He wrote down, he kept a record of all the events that had taken place throughout this period. Everything was written down and recorded for posterity. He was meticulous. He set out the details. He called for all the Jewish people to observe Purim, to remember the deliverance from their enemies. It was done every year so they wouldn't forget. It was to be a time of celebration, and you know what? It still continues to this day. The observation of Purim. Purim, in verse 21, he told them to celebrate every year on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. Now he wants to make it plain the reasons for this celebration. They're associated with all the events that took place on those days of the month. So everywhere in those 127 provinces, they fought on one day, celebrated the next. The only difference, the Jewish people in the capital, Susa, fought for 2 days. Then they rested on the third. It was a festival. Recognizing the events that took place on those days, Mordecai wanted them to remember this is a cause for remembrance. It's also a cause for celebration of the deliverance. Now, it's something that we can relate to in some respects, because what happens on the 25th of April every year in Australia? We celebrate one day. It's called Anzac Day. Why? To remember the sacrifices of those who gave their lives for the freedoms that we have today. And that's why we say, lest we forget. Our freedoms, what we have today, didn't happen by chance or accident. People sacrifices their lives, and we're to remember on Anzac Day. Are we glorifying war? No, we're giving thanks for those who answered the call and sacrificed their lives to give us what we've got today. And this is what Purim is designed to do with the Jewish people, so that they don't forget what was accomplished. The avoidance, because that was when the Jewish people got rid of their enemies. This is why they did it, celebrating God's victory, and they enjoyed that victory. And lastly, the agreement. They were also to celebrate it as the month. Their sadness was turned to joy. Their crying for the dead was turned into celebration. He told them to celebrate those days as days of joyful feasting, as a time for giving food to each other and presents to the poor. So the Jewish people agreed to do what Mordecai had written to them, and they agreed to hold the celebration every year. Now, what I find fascinating here is it doesn't seem as though the people were divided over whether to celebrate it or not. They were not going to hold a referendum to say all those in favour yes, all those in favour no. They didn't have that. It wasn't to be enshrined in the Persian calendar events. Our text says the people unanimously agreed to Mordecai's proposal. They were united. They were on the same page. They wanted the same goal. They wanted to be left alone in peace instead of always being in fear of their lives. And it made sense. They understood what it was like to have a cloud of doom and gloom over you everywhere you went. They'd experienced the mourning, the wailing, the uncertainty. They had been reduced to sackcloth and ashes by Haman and his law. Now he was gone. Their enemies gone. It's time to celebrate. It's time to cast off the shackles. Things were looking up. And what better time to celebrate and give thanks? Mordecai's idea was to be an annual event for celebration. Set aside, special day, remember everything that had happened. And it was more than just a memory of these things. It encouraged people to be actively involved in community. It was designed to get people in participating in the events with feasting with joy, sending portions of food as well as sending gifts to the poor. The reason, all the Jews, rich and poor, they were all delivered. All should be able to participate in and celebrate what had occurred. Now, they all agreed to this custom. It was to be